So now that we've baked everything out and we have created our normal map in Photoshop, I'm going to go back to my bake scene and delete everything but the low poly because we are now preparing our mesh to go to Substance Painter. Make sure to not overwrite your original scene so that you can go back to it if you need to rebake. Also, obviously, if you want to render out those textures in 8K, just like I mentioned before, you can do that overnight and just let it run. And you don't have to do it at all in the beginning if that just takes too much time. Like, it's not a necessity, but it just gives you that anti-aliasing if you need it. That being said, we can now work on the low poly and start putting things together so that we can render this out and get a decent bake in Substance Painter out of it, because we only baked the normal map and we still need to bake ambient occlusion, curvature, and all the other maps that we need. Now, one of the things that's important about preparing this mesh to go to Substance Painter is that we want to have most of these pieces freestanding so that I can go in and paint on these sections and apply decals without it being obstructed by other parts of the mesh. So for example, if I would take these pieces here and just move them over and place them like this, I would have a hard time going in here in Substance Painter and painting these areas that are overlapping because I just can't reach them with the brush. And unfortunately, that is a downside of the Substance Painter workflow. Substance Painter doesn't allow you to hide parts of the mesh, so that functionality doesn't exist, which is why we need to separate these pieces out in a meaningful way, or in a way that works for us. And the way that I've already done it is a really good start, but I do want to move these pieces around just slightly so that they're arranged just a little bit better. So let's move these pieces into place so that we can easier work with them. Like right now, if I'm going to try to project a decal onto this stuff is kind of in the way here, and I'm going to have to like fiddle with the camera, which is not something that I like doing. So I'm just going to move this, space this out a little bit better so that I have an easier time with the pieces I want to possibly project decals on. So first thing we want to do is turn off correct face attributes. Right now, if I move something, the UVs will break because this is turned on. So make sure this is off, and now this is working and not destroying the UVs. Also, I don't need to look at the UV coordinates at the shader editor right now, so I'm just going to minimize that window. And then the last thing I want to do is turn on increment snapping, and by doing that, I can just snap on the grid. So first, we're going to just move this out, and now we can easily project stuff on it. And then we can also take this guy over here, and we can move that forward. And now we can project stuff on it without getting in the way. And maybe this guy we can move in like this and then move forward. And this guy we can move like this and then move backward. I'm not overly concerned with this piece here because I'm mostly going to be, like, it's far enough away that I don't think the other stuff's going to be intersecting with it too much. So we could even bring this in a little more if we wanted to, and maybe bring it like back to the somewhat more to the center. So maybe even somewhere here. That feels good. And then the next thing that we need to do is move these pieces back to their original position. So let's actually switch back to the shader editor, and let's bring in the normal map that we baked. So I'm going to bring in that 4K normal map final, set this to none color, and then bring in another normal map node, connect everything up like we did plenty of times before. And then we can switch the renderer to Eevee and set this to rendered. And now we should see where these pieces belong. So give it a second to update. There we go. And you can see for this piece, for example, this actually belongs here in this spot. And if I leave it here and bake everything, it won't pick up any of the ambient occlusion from this piece. So it will be fully white or almost fully white in the ambient occlusion, and it will stick out because if it's in here, it will actually catch some of the darkening effects from the wall. So in order to do that, we need to move it to the correct position. So the first thing we're going to do is actually separate that by selection. So P and then separate by selection. And then I'm going to move it over by pressing Control. And then I'm going to press Control A, apply all to move the pivot to 0, 0, 0. And now I'm going to make a copy of it. But one thing to keep in mind is if we take a look at the UV coordinates. So right now, the UV coordinates of this thing look like this. Now, if I duplicate it without moving the UVs, Substance Painter will give me errors when baking the UVs because it's going to try to bake several informations on top of one another because the UVs will share the same area. So we need to fix that. But before we can do that, we need to duplicate this around. So let's just do Shift-D to duplicate, and then we're going to do R, and then Z, and then hold down Control and move it in the right position. And then again, Shift-D, R, Z, hold down Control, move it in the right position. Shift-D, R, Z, hold down Control to snap, and then move it in the right position. So as you can see, they are now sitting in the correct spot. This actually needs to be moved back 5 degrees. And then, as you remember, if we join these objects, you can see that all of these faces are now overlaying in the UVs and sharing the same information. And I don't want that, so I need to move it out of the 0 to 1 area. Now, Substance Painter will only bake stuff that's in the 0 to 1 area. And in order to not get errors with overlaying UV coordinates, I need to move these out of the 0 to 1 area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press G and then X to constrain on the X-axis, and then 1 to move it over 1 unit. And now everything is moved over 1 unit to the right, which means that when we're baking, it will only bake this one piece, and it won't bake these pieces on top of one another. But these pieces will still share the same information as this original piece, because they are essentially in the same location, just moved over 1 unit. So this texture gets tiled, so it gets positioned here, and then it also gets positioned here. So these pieces will pick up the correct information. It will just not break apart during the baking process. So we need to do the same thing for these other pieces up here. So let's separate by selection and then go into move mode, hold down Control. And then here we just need one copy, and we need to copy this guy over here. So separate by selection and then Control A, and then we can do Shift D, R, Z, hold down Control, and just rotate this in the correct spot. And what we actually want to do is we probably want to mirror that so that the ambient occlusion that it picks up from here is in the right position. So we can do Alt X and then mirror this over, and then add modifier, apply modifier. And then we don't need, and we need to move out the UV coordinates as well, just like we did before. So select all of these, and then G, X, 1 to move everything over 1 unit. And that's it for these guys. And lastly, we need to do the same for this piece. Separate by selection, move this over. And now this is in the right spot. And then we can do Shift D. Well, before we duplicate, let's actually Control A, apply all, so that the pivot is at 0. And then we can do Shift D to duplicate, right mouse button to paste in place, and then RX, and then hold down Control to turn on snapping. And then see if we can find the right spot for it. So RX, hold down Control. It's gotten a little tricky. There we go. And then this should be 120 degrees. So we can just do Shift D and then R, X 120. I guess it was a different value. So let's try RX 90. No, RX 100. There we go. And now this is in the correct spot. And then for both of these, let's join them and select all of the UV coordinates, and then G, X, 1 to move them over 1 unit. And then lastly, we need to join all of these, and then this needs to go over here as well. So let's do, let's see, Shift D, right mouse button to paste in place. And then we can also just move this over, so hold down Control. And actually here we might have to just adjust the pivot manually so we can do so we can line this up properly. So let's do that next. So let's center the pivot on this, Alt S, and then we can also apply scale and apply rotation. And then we can use Shift Alt S to move the pivot point. And we can turn on vertex snapping and just snap that here in the center, and then press Shift Alt S again to commit. And then we can use mirror and just mirror this over. And then we can do add modifier, apply modifiers. And then lastly, we need to take all of the information here and move it out of the 0 to 1 area. So basically, we don't have to move this any further. So let's deselect these vertices here, but be careful to only select everything in the 1 to 2 area. And then we can do GX1. And now only one of these pieces, this front one, is in the 0 to 1 area. And all the other ones are in the 1 to 2 area, which means we're not going to get any baking issues. It will only bake it one time for this piece here, and then all the other ones will share the information from that one. And there we go. So that's the basic setup that we need. Let's join all of these guys. Control J, and let's just rename that low poly. And then we can already start bringing that to Substance Painter and seeing what that gives us. So let's bring this to Substance Painter and do a first test bake, and then we can iterate on this. So first we want to rename the material. Right now this is called low poly normal test, and I'm just going to call that drone material for now. And we can leave the name at low poly. And then we're going to go to export, choose FBX, turn on limit to selected objects, which means it's only going to export the selected object, and we only needed to export mesh and nothing else. And then choose an appropriate folder where you want to export your low poly to. For me, that's in the VRP folder of my project. So I'm just going to overwrite that and click Export FBX. And then I have Substance Painter open, and I'm just going to make a new project. So File, New, set my document resolution to 496, set my normal map to OpenGL, and everything else we're going to leave at default. And then just click Select and navigate to the directory where you have your low poly file and just select that one. And then press OK. And that should take a second. And then over here, you can see your mesh. And then over here in the texture set list, you can see the name of the material on the object, which we just changed to drone material. And then down here in the texture set settings, you can see the different channels that we have. Now we do want to have an emissive channel that we need to add. We can do that right now just to do it one time. So click on plus and choose emissive, because we are going to have some emissive parts. And then right now we want to load in the normal map next. So scroll down here, and where it says select normal map, we can drag and drop the normal map into. So I just opened my Windows Explorer, and I'm going to drag the normal map that I've saved out into Substance Painter. For me, that is normal map 4K final. So make sure you choose the right normal map, the one that you have properly adjusted. And then we're going to drag and drop that down here into Materials tab, and then let go of the left mouse button. And then here you can see the Import Resources dialog. You want to switch it to current session so that we only import it to the current session, and we want to change it to texture so that Substance knows what kind of data we're feeding it. And then just click on Import, and then you will see it show up here. You can also just look for the name by just typing it in, and it should show up in that list. So if I type in normal map underscore 4K, here it is. And then we can just left click and drag and drop that into our normal map slot. And then it takes a second. And here you can see we have our normal map loaded in, and everything is looking great so far. No issues, really sharp, so that's good. And let's also switch the viewport. So if we press F2, you can switch between divided and full viewport of just the mesh. So F1 is the 3D viewport and the UV viewport. F2 is just the 3D viewport, and F3 is just the 2D viewport. And here you can see our 0 to 1 area, and here you can see our 1 to 2 area. And the first thing I want to do is I want to do a quick test bake just to see how everything is going to come out. So to do that, you're going to click on Bake Mesh Maps. And then since we already fed it a normal map, we want to turn off the normal map here because we already have a normal map loaded in. So turn that off. And then for the test bake, we're just going to use a 2K resolution, so 248 by 248. And then we're going to click on Bake Selected Textures without adjusting anything else. And it'll now take a while, and you can see it will generate ambient occlusion, curvature, position, and thickness. So just give it a moment. And here we go, we have our bake. And as you can see, that turned out really nice. So if we click up here, we can switch through the different channels, and we can switch to the ambient occlusion channel. And then you can see this worked out great. So all of these pieces that we put in place, they have got the ambient occlusion information from the mesh. So you can see how they get darker here because they're picking up the distance to the mesh. These guys are picking up the distance up here, so they get some ambient occlusion. And then the same for everything down here. You know, see how this is like really dark and feels like it's exactly in the right spot, and everything is catching the correct ambient occlusion information. We're also getting some darkening in here. The only thing that we're missing is ambient occlusion information from these pieces overlapping. And I'm gonna talk about that next. So in order to get the correct ambient occlusion, or an approximation of the correct ambient occlusion, we need to do a little bit more work. So what I mean right now, for example, is this piece, which will be embedded underneath here, is not getting any ambient occlusion information from these pieces because it's not positioned in the correct spot. But if I would position this in here, then I would have a really hard time going in here and trying to like paint on this because everything would be overlapping. So we can create some extra geometry in Substance Painter and use that as a high poly mesh just for the ambient occlusion bake to get that ambient occlusion information that we're looking for. In general, if we have parts that animate, we want to avoid baking ambient occlusion in there. So for example, this piece can be attached to the body on the side, which then would cause ambient occlusion onto this face. But once the legs extend and rotate downwards, then this ambient occlusion would be gone. So in these kind of cases, I usually don't bake the ambient occlusion into the mesh and leave it to screen space ambient occlusion to get that effect. Same with these pieces. If they're folded up, they're overlaying on top of one another, which means everything here would be really dark. But that would also mean that when they're extended, we would lose a lot of the detail that we have in the mesh, and I don't want that. So in the next step, what we have to do is we are going to go back to Blender and create a blocker mesh that gives us that ambient occlusion that we are missing on some of these pieces right now. So save out the scene so that you can get back to it. So I'm just going to save this out. And now I can get back to it if I want to. And then let's go back to Blender and create that high poly blocker piece. So let's create our blocker object that's going to cast ambient occlusion onto our low poly. To do that, just duplicate the low poly, paste in place, and then with increment snap turned on, we're just going to move it back. And then these pieces here I'm actually not going to need, so we can just delete them. And then let's reassemble this piece over here. So let's move it over and move it in. And do the same for this guy. Move it over, move it in. And then we can use this piece here. And move it up, move it over, move it back. And now we have that in the right spot to block light and create ambient occlusion. Let's also rename this to blocker. And then we also need the wheel. So you can just take the wheel from back here, move this forward, and then move it back. And we can also turn on vertex snap here if we want, and just snap it like this. And now this blocker should be in the correct spot. Now, for the low poly, in order for this to work correctly, we actually need to move this back. So let's set this back to increment. And just move it back a couple of units. And so then let's see, what other objects do we need? First, we probably want to do something with this here. So on the low poly, let's actually move this forward just a tad. And then let's take this piece here from the blocker. Actually, it's going to be hard to separate all of this now. So I'm just going to duplicate these two pieces from the low poly. So let's go to face mode. Shift D, and then separate. And now all we need to do is reverse their position. So we're going to move this over, and we're going to move this over. So what's happening is this is all blocker geometry. So this is here to cast ambient occlusion on the base. And this piece, or actually this piece is here to cast ambient occlusion on this from the backside. We could have this in one piece if we wanted to, but I've just set it up this way for now. And I think in terms of the blockers that we need, that might be most of it. So you can see we're blocking a fair amount of light here. Maybe we want to introduce this one to the blocker as well. So in order to do that, we can just duplicate that, hold down Control, separate by selection, and then add this to our blocker geometry. And by doing it that way, we will get some ambient occlusion here from this piece. And I don't want to add ambient occlusion to the wheel itself, because once the wheel starts rotating, I don't want to have a black spot that keeps rotating. So I think we can also just move this forward just to give it a little bit more space in the low poly. Let's rename this to blocker again. And yeah, that's mostly the changes that I wanted to make for the blocker geometry, I think. So in order for this to work correctly in Substance Painter, there's two things we need to do. Select all of the UVs in the blocker and move these out of the 0 to 1 area. So just press G and then 1 to move it over. And then we also need to give the blocker a different material so that it separates in the material list in Substance Painter. So let's do Shift Q, assign material, add new material. And we're just going to call that one blocker. And then now we have our blocker material, and we have our low poly material. Actually, this should be called drone material. So let's call this blocker material, and maybe just crank up the base color to white. So all the way to white. And then for the low poly, we should do the same thing. This shouldn't be darkened at all. So we have blocker and low poly. And now what we're going to do is we're going to export both of these pieces as one object. So we're going to export this as our new low poly. So File, Export, FBX. And we're going to export this as lowpoly.fbx. Make sure that limit to selected objects is on and turn on just the mesh, and then click on Export FBX, and then we will create one mesh out of these two objects. So here I'm back in Substance Painter with my original file, and I'm going to replace the low poly with the one we've just exported. So I'm going to go to Project Configuration, click on File, Select, and then select the lowpoly.fbx file that I've just saved out that contains both the blocker and the low poly geometry. So let's click Open, click OK, and then you will see this updates to blocker material and drone material. And I can now toggle the different pieces on and off. So here is my low poly without the blocker, and here is just the blocker geometry. And you can see on my low poly, I do not have any ambient occlusion from the blocker pieces yet. In order to get that, we need to rebake. So just select the drawn material, click on Bake Mesh Maps, and then this time we only need ambient occlusion, so we can turn everything else off, and then just click on Bake Selected Textures. And then it's going to take a second to calculate. And then we can hide the blocker material, and now you can see we have the ambient occlusion information here. We have the ambient occlusion information here. We have a lot of ambient occlusion going on here. And this is all working pretty decently. So good stuff. And now we have that ambient occlusion from these pieces that we were missing. And we can just save this out as a new file if we want to, or just overwrite the old one. I'm just going to save a new file, DroneBake AO blocker. And there we go. Now, one of the last steps I like to do in my setup is I would like to assemble a more final version of this piece so that when I start texturing the individual pieces, I also have a way to preview how it's going to look like when all of the pieces are assembled. You can imagine that when I try to draw on this and try to place decals here, it's kind of hard to line it up when all of the pieces are separated. And in order to see what it would look like lined up, we're going to go back to Blender and go into our low poly. And we're going to make a version of this that is all assembled and lined up. And so let's just start doing that next. So to do that, let's just duplicate the entire low poly and move it over. And then we're going to start by just assembling one of these like leg pieces. So let's separate this by selection and then start assembling it like this. And then we're going to do the same thing here, separate by selection, separate by selection. I guess we could do individual pieces as well if we wanted to, but just a bit more confident with the separate by selection for now. Let's move this over. Let's move this back. Here we can go into vertex snap mode again if we want to. I think I moved this piece slightly off grid, so I have to do it with vertex snap. And then here, separate by selection, and same here. Well, let's undo and turn on increment snapping again. Okay. So now the leg piece is assembled and we have one of these guys. And let me also separate this. And then let's go in here. I guess for this piece, I don't need this. I don't need a duplicate of this because I already have it over here and I don't need to see what that looks like. I guess we can, one of the things we could do is we could kind of like move it in here and maybe move it up. But I feel like, no, let's not do that. Let's just close the top lid, move that down, and have that positioned over here. Let's keep going with this and let's set up the leg correctly so that we can actually rotate the individual elements. So we can create sort of a mini rig. First I have to fix this issue here where this piece is offset. So let's vertex snap this back in the right position. And then let's start joining some of these pieces. So this is going to be one piece that's going to move around. So let's call that leg lower guard. And we want the axis or the pivot for this point to be in the center of these two. So I'm going to select these edge rings, press Alt-S to center pivot on selection. And now I can go into rotate mode, press Y, and I can rotate it around that position. And then I have this piece here. So let's actually join these two together, Control J, and call this wheel guard. And then we need to figure out where the pivot for this is going to be. And I think it's going to be up here. So we can move it up and down easily. And then we have the wheel, Alt S to center pivot, and call that one wheel. And then we have this upper piece here. Let's call that leg upper guard. And then the pivot for this guy, we want to set it to here, so that if I want to rotate this, I could do it in the correct position. And then we have this guy here. So let's just select all of this and detach it, and just call that leg base. And here we want the pivot to be in the center of this this sphere here, I guess. So let's look at it from the front or from the left. Select these vertices here, press Alt S, and then let's see, this is the right spot. Yep. And then we can rotate this piece around this joint. And now none of these pieces move together, so we need to parent things correctly to one another. So let's set everything up so that when we rotate the pieces, they are all connected together. First thing we need to do is parent the wheel to the wheel guard. So right now I can move these pieces individually, but I want the wheel to move with the wheel guard when I move the wheel guard. So select the wheel guard, make sure the wheel guard is the active object, press Ctrl P and set parent to object. So now when I move the wheel guard, the leg moves with it, and I can still select the leg and rotate it by itself. And then one other thing I want to do really quick is just go in here, select these vertices, make this the active vertex, turn on vertex snapping and snap it down here. And now this gives me more wiggle room to move it in and out of the cylinder. And then the lower guard, I want to parent that to the wheel guard as well. So select the lower guard, select the wheel guard, Ctrl P, parent to object. So now when I move the wheel guard, the lower guard moves with it. And I can also rotate this based on the pivot here. Great. Now this piece doesn't need to be its own piece. It should be part of the upper guard. So make the upper guard the active object and then Ctrl J to join. And then we're going to parent the wheel guard to the upper guard. So now we can move this or rotate this and everything rotates together. And then lastly, we need to parent this to this, set parent to object. And now we can rotate this, hold down Control to incrementally rotate. And there we go. We have our leg mechanic set up. Let's call that one leg 01. And then turn on increment snapping and move this over on the y-axis to over here. Now here I accidentally joined everything, so I'm going to duplicate it. I'm going to delete it and duplicate the original low poly. Hold down Control for increment snapping and then get rid of all of this. And then we're going to separate by selection here and here. And we're going to call that top. We're going to call that one bottom. And we're going to call that one grenade. And then we can do increment snapping and Alt S to center pivot on these guys and just increment snap these together. So now I have the base set up for the drone. Let's make a new group, call that drone assembled. And then we're going to move all of these pieces into the drone assembled group. And then we can hide the low poly group, take the drone assembled, turn on increment snap, G, Y, hold down Control, move this over. And it looks like this is in the right position now. And then what we need to do is kind of like adjust these pieces. So you can see everything here is at 0, 0, 0. And then this piece for some reason is not at 0 on the y-axis. So let's just line this up so that this is in the correct spot. So let's turn on vertex snap and then just snap it to here. And it should be at 0 now, which is correct. And then let's see. I think that it needs to snap to down here as well. It looks like it moved just ever so slightly, but yeah, this seems to be the correct position. One thing we could do is set this to rendered, just to make sure we're lining everything up correctly. And let's also go to the shader editor and then make sure that the normal map is loaded in correctly. So there we go. And yeah, this looks like it's the correct position. And then what we're going to do is duplicate the legs around. But first we're going to create a few empties or locators. So let's go to empty, plane axis, and it gets created here in the center, which is why you can't see it. Set the radius to 0.5, move this down, but turn on increment snap before, and then move this down to maybe -4 meters on the z-axis. And we're going to call that one drone. And then we're going to create another plane axis empty, set the radius to 0.25, move this down to maybe -3, call that one drone leg 01, Shift D to duplicate, and just rename it to 02. And one more time, Shift D to duplicate, rename it to 03. And now we also need to duplicate these guys 3 times. So turn on increment snap, Shift D, move this over, Shift D, move it over. So we have leg 02 and leg 03. And another thing we can do is link these together correctly. So drone leg 01 goes to leg 01, so make leg 01 locator the active object. So the locator is actually this, so we need to select it like this. So leg 01 first, and then drone leg 01, and then Control P, parent to object. And then we can select the locator, press R, press C, hold down Control, and do 120. And now this is located or rotated to the correct axis. And then let's select leg 02, move this over, and then we're going to parent leg 02, so just leg 02 to drone leg 02, Control P, parent to object, and then we're going to use RZ and then 240, RZ120, and now that's in the correct location. And then last time, select this, move it over, and then select just leg 03 and drone leg 03, Control P, parent to object, and there we go. Now all of these are parented to the locators down here, and we can use these for rotation if we need to. And then all we need to do is parent everything to the drone locator. So we're just going to select the drone locator last, Control P, parent to object. And now if we choose this locator down here, everything moves. And we can still move these around. Make sure to set this to local. So R, Y, hold down Control, R, Y, hold down Control. And we can do the same here, R, Y. And just rotate this just as we want. And we can do different poses for this guy, which is great. So let me just undo that. And next we're going to put this in a position where the legs are extended. So let's position this in the scene. Let's take the drone locator and just move this over here. And let's move it out just a tad. And we can also move it forward just a little bit. And then we're going to select everything, Shift D to duplicate, and move that over here. And then we're going to make a post version of this guy here. So let's do 50 or -50 on these legs. put 90 on these ones. There we go. Now we have a post version of both. And what we can do next is just rename these really quick. So drone legs extended, drone compact, and then we need to adjust the UVs. So select all of these guys here. Don't select the locators, just the faces. And then select the faces, switch this to UV editor, and then we want to move this out of the 0 to 1 area. Because all of our texturing later on in Substance Painter will be done over here. So we'll texture our pieces over here, we'll apply the decals over here, and then we'll just use these two versions of the drone as to check what our texturing does to other positions of it. And then one thing I actually want to do over here is just move this up and move this up to something like this. And now let's select all of this again. Make sure to not select any locators, then press 3 to go to face mode. And now we're going to move the UVs out from the 0 to 1 area. So GX1, and it's moving everything over. And if we now select everything, you can see that the only thing that's in the 0 to 1 area and the only thing that will be paintable is this original low poly piece. So this is the only thing that we're going to be able to texture and paint on, and the other stuff is just for reference. So here I'm back in Substance Painter, and I'm just going to bring in my new low poly mesh. So go to Project Configuration, go to Select, and then bring in that low poly that we have just exported. And you can see it updates, and we can now see our combined version of the drone, and we can really see the different pieces shine. Now there's one issue that I'm seeing, which is this piece here. It's too bright, it doesn't have the ambient occlusion information. So let's quickly go back to Blender and add that to the blocker actually. So it's essentially this piece here that needs some ambient occlusion. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this blocker, hold down Control, and then delete this, move this over, and then I want to delete this from the blocker as well. So now I have the low poly, and I have the blocker, and then also maybe get rid of the wheel. And now we should get some decent ambient occlusion on this piece as well. So let's just combine the blocker, and then one more time we're gonna export this all out. So select everything, File, Export, FBX, Low Poly, Selected Objects Only, Mesh Only, and then go back to Substance Painter. And you can see in the blocker, there's no blocker here right now. But if I go to Project Configuration and update the file, press OK. There we go, we have the blocker here now as well. And now we're going to rebake this whole thing one more time. I'm going to go to Texture Set Settings in the drone material. So select the drone material first, go to Texture Set Settings, and then go to Bake Mesh Maps. Now we only want to do world space normal, ambient occlusion, curvature, position, thickness. And I'm going to crank up the dilation to 64, and I'm also going to apply diffusion, and I'm going to use a really high resolution, which is 8192, and then I'm going to bake selected textures. And as you can see, it's starting to bake, and if you don't have a fast computer, this will take a while, and you can just use 4K or 2K for now. But if you have the time, just let it run, let it go through one bake. It shouldn't be like extremely long, maybe a couple of minutes. And then once you have the results of that, we can work with a nice texture resolution here in Substance Painter. Again, you can always use a lower texture resolution, and because this is non-destructive, at the end of it, once we're done texturing, you can do one more bake pass and update all of the maps to a higher resolution. but I'm just going to let it run now, and I'm going to pause the video and get back to you once the calculation is done. All right, here we are. Baking is finished, and you can see that the piece here in the center that was on my blocker material is now a darker color, which is nice, and it just fits in there much better than before. And yeah, everything baked out nicely. And let's just save this out. And we're going to call that one drone base, because that's what we're going to use to start texturing from. So now that we've brought in everything, we can hide the blocker material, and we can make the drone material our active object. And then go to the layer set and add a new paint layer by clicking on the add paint layer icon over here. And with that, I can select the layer, go to brush mode by pressing B, and then try to paint on the map. We are now in ambient occlusion mode, which is why this is not working. So I have to press M first to go to material mode. And then I can paint, and by left clicking on the mesh and dragging, you can see I can paint on the object. And here you can see what this whole setup was for. I can now paint on the centerpiece here, and it'll update on all the other pieces. I can also paint here, and it'll update on all the other pieces. And the same is true for all of these pieces over here. And I'm only able to paint any of these pieces here. I'm not able to actually paint on this. As you can see, if I try painting on this, it doesn't let me do it. I can only do in this section over here. So this is to set up our textures, and this is to preview it in a post version and a collapsed version. So there we go. The last thing that we need to do is bring in the curvature map. So we can go to our texture set settings and scroll all the way. Sorry, not the curvature map. We can bring in the ID map. So let's do that next. So I'm just going to drag in my color ID map that I've saved out earlier. So the PNG file that we've saved out, I'm just going to drag it in. And then just like before, we're going to set this to current session and set it to texture, and then click import. And then you can see it shows up down here. And then all we need to do is drag it into our ID slot. And then if we switch from material view to ID, you can see that all of our pieces are now colored according to the material that it's going to use. So we have the rubber, the metal, the blue plastic, the red plastic, and our emissive parts. So everything is working as intended. This is all great. And there we go. So one last thing we could do is actually get rid of the blocker material here. And in order to get rid of it in Substance, we need to get rid of it from the low poly file. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to Blender, and I'm going to select everything in here actually. And I'm going to deselect the blocker, and I'm going to export this file, export FBX, and save it out as low poly _ no blocker. Make sure it's set to selected object and mesh, click export FBX. And then we're going to go back to Substance, and we're going to go to project configuration, click on select, and load in that low poly no blocker FBX file we have just exported. And once we do that, you can see that this material doesn't exist any longer, and we only are dealing with one texture set. The upside of this is it'll make Substance Painter a little bit faster because we're not loading in 2 sets of 8K textures, but just 1 set. So if you have performance issues, that's a valid workaround. If you have a fast computer, you can also just leave it in here and just work on the drone material. It's really up to you. I'm gonna save this out, make a new file, and then we can get started on texturing. So let's start texturing this. And to do that, we're going to add a folder. So click on the add folder icon, and then we're going to rename the folder to plastic. So in this folder, all of the layers for the plastic material are going to live. Then we're going to add a fill layer by clicking on the add fill layer button. And we're going to rename that to blue _ plastic _ base. And then we're going to left click and drag that into our plastic folder. And this layer, I only want to add color and roughness information to. So I'm going to turn off the height channel, the metal channel, the normal channel, and the emissive channel of this layer. And then we can start choosing a color for our blue value. So let's try something like 0.014 for the red channel, 0.033 for the green channel, and maybe 0.054 for the blue channel. And as you can see, it tints everything blue. And we can also change the roughness, which will change the reflectivity of our plastic material. Let's set this to 0.4 for now. And then we also do need a second layer for the red plastic. So left click on it and then Ctrl D to duplicate, or you can right click on it and then choose duplicate layers. Let's rename that to red plastic base. And then we're going to switch the color here to something around 0.228 for red, and maybe 0.023 for green, and 0.03 for blue. And now you can see we have our red channel. And right now the red channel is on top of the blue channel, so it overwrites all of the information. So we need to mask out the different areas where we want red or blue plastic. To do that, we're going to right click on the red layer and click on Add Mask with Color Selection. And then this gives you the eyedropper tool down here. And once you click it, you can select an area or a color from your ID map to apply this layer mask to. So I only want the areas in red to display the red plastic material. So let me left click on it to select it. And then we're also going to do the same for the blue plastic base. Right mouse button, Add Mask with Color Selection, pick color, and then just select the blue. And lastly, we also want to mask out the entire folder so that the plastic material doesn't overlay on any of the other areas. So let's click on Add Mask with Color Selection. And then we're going to pick color, select blue, and pick color again, and select red. And now this whole layer group or layer folder has a mask based on the colors I've just selected. So if I switch to mask, you can see that everything that is tinted red and blue in my ID map is now colored white, which means those parts of the layer will be visible, and everything else is colored black, which means those parts won't be visible. And this is exactly the behavior that I want. If you press M, you can switch back to your regular material mode. And just to demonstrate what's going on, we can always add a paint layer, and then make sure you go to your area over here, because you can only paint in this section because of the way that the UVs are set up. And then you can just go in and you can see that we can paint in the areas where the plastic material is showing. But once we start drawing on a different area, you can see it won't show up there. So let's get rid of this and consider this the base for our plastic material for now. So next, let's create a new layer group and drag it out of our plastic folder in case it was in there. And then let's just call that metal and put it underneath our plastic group. And then we're gonna actually delete this space layer that we had and add a new fill layer, and left click and drag that into the metal group. And here as well, we only want color, roughness, and metalness. This is going to be a metal material, so we're going to turn on the metalness channel. And then what we are going to do is we're going to just darken this layer a little bit, maybe 0.2. And then we can play with the metallic value. For now, let's give it something around 0.5. And play with the roughness a little bit. Let's do 0.1. And I just want to get a bit of contrast so that I know this is going to be the area where my metal material is being displayed. And that's really all I want as a start. Maybe increase the brightness a little bit of this material. Maybe try something around here. And this is all just temporary because we're gonna start working on the plastic material first and then move on to the metal material. And as you can see, when we adjust the metallic values here, it adjusts the metallic values in the area where we have plastic as well. So if I go to my metallic map and change this, you can see it's adjusting it everywhere. And that's because we haven't masked out this layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the layer and click on Add Mask with Color Selection. And then we're going to pick color and we're going to choose black. And now if I go back to my metallic channel, you can see it's only applying that information in the areas that I've just chosen. So I can go back to the content of my metal layer. And now I can adjust the metallic values in here without affecting any of my plastic material attributes, which is exactly what I wanted. So let's just set this to 0.2. And let's leave the metallic value at 0.25. And we're just gonna keep it at that at this point. So let's start refining our metal plastic material a little bit. And to do that, let's rotate the environment cube map to a good position. So if you hold down Shift and right mouse button, you can rotate the environment cube map, which rotates the direction where your light is coming from in the scene. And then let's go to the plastic group and add a new fill layer in here. And this fill layer, we only want to add height information. So we're going to turn everything off but height. And then we're going to add a black mask so that this entire layer is masked out. And then with the mask selected, so left click on the mask and then select Add Fill. This will add a slot here that allows us to load in a texture. And we want to use a texture for this mask. So go to your procedurals and then in here type in dirt and look for dirt 3 and then left click and drag that into the grayscale slot. Now nothing has really happened yet, and that's because we haven't adjusted the height value in the original fill layer yet. So right now the height's at 0, which means it doesn't add or subtract from our height. But once we change the slider, you can see the texture coming in. So we can add to our surface or remove from our surface. And since this is going to be a grain, I wanted to remove from the surface. So let's try a value like -0.05. And then you can see that this is tiled way too low. So we need way more of these points. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into that fill layer here and scroll up. And then you can see a scale value here. And let's just crank this up to something like 32. And this is already starting to look good. Let's see what that looks like even higher. Maybe try 50. And we can also change the balance of this map to increase the contrast. So if we go into the mask and then play with the balance slider, you can see that it just increases the contrast. So maybe try something like 0.6 just to make this a bit more visible. And there we have it. We've got our base grain for both the plastic layers. And the cool thing is, since this is on top of both of our plastic layers, it will just add to everything underneath. So let's call this layer plastic grain. And then we continue building up the plastic. Now, so far, we've only added some variation in the height channel. We haven't done anything to the roughness channel. And one thing you'll notice is when you zoom out, you kind of like lose a little bit of that texture detail. So I want to change some of the rendering attributes in Substance Painter. So I'm going to go to my display settings over here, and then I'm going to switch all the way over here and set anisotropic filtering to very high. And I'm going to set the mid-map bias to very sharp. And when you do that, you will notice that your texture will stay sharper even when you're zoomed out, and you get a little bit of a better idea of what it's actually going to look like in your final renders. So now that we have done that, we can keep building up the plastic. So let's just rename this to actually plastic grain height. And then we can Control D to duplicate that and call that one plastic grain roughness. And this layer, we're going to go back and turn off height, but turn on roughness now. And then we can go back into the dirt channel, and maybe this time we can use a different texture to influence the roughness. So let's choose dirt 4 and drag that in here. And then let's go to the mask channel, and then you can see here is our dirt 4, and this is tiled way too often. So let's go in here and bring this down, maybe something like 16. And let's try what we get when we switch this to triplanar projection. So yeah, maybe use triplanar for now. We can play with the hardness a little bit and kind of like set it to 0.8 so that in those transitional areas it stays a little sharper. And then press M again to go back to your original mesh or your material view. And you can already see this is adding a bit of breakup in the plastic. So we're getting these lines in the specular here. So if I switch this to roughness, you can see that this is what this texture is doing. So this is the original and this is with the roughness. So let's switch the blending mode to multiply. But if we do it here, you can see that we are in the base color channel. So it means we're changing the blending mode in the color channel to multiply, which means it won't do anything because we are in the roughness channel. So I'm going to set this back to normal and switch it up here to roughness and then switch this to multiply. And then you can see it's affecting the way that our roughness gets displayed. And then if I go back, you can see that I'm getting this nice breakup. So let's actually see what we can do here. Maybe bring the hardness down just a tad. Doesn't really do much, so let's try 0.5 for this. And then let's play with the scale first. And we had it at 16. So maybe leave it at 16 and set it back to UV projection. See what that looks like. And it's actually not bad. I think I might leave this at UV projection. But what I don't like is how intense this is. Like this is quite a bit of breakup. So let's try 12. Go back to material view. And then let's just bring down the intensity of the texture. So let's bring it down to something around 40 maybe. And you can see that at these like angles when we see the specular, we still get a decent amount of breakup, but it's not as intense as before anymore. We can also go back to the original fill layer by clicking on it and change the roughness value here. And depending on what we choose, you can see it becomes either more intense or less intense. And maybe set this to like 0.35. And then leave it at that for the first roughness adjustment that we're doing. So let's keep going with our roughness pass. So I'm just going to press Ctrl D to duplicate that. And I'm going to rename that to color. And then we're going to switch back to the original fill layer and turn off roughness and turn on color. And then we're going to go back into the mask. And let's change the scale here. Let's try using something like 4. And let's change the blending mode to multiply so that this darkens our texture. And we can also go into the base color and crank this all the way down to black. And this is obviously way too intense. So first, let's see if we can play with the balance a little bit. So maybe bring this down. And then change the intensity of the multiply. And maybe bring the balance back up just a tad. And the key to all of this is subtlety. Like I don't want to actually see too much of this. So let's set this to something around 10. And then you can see, I'm not sure if the video is actually going to pick it up, but there is some subtle color variation. So if we go into the base color, you can see there's a little bit of noise that gets added, which I like because plastic isn't perfectly clean, obviously. And then later on, we can tweak all of these values because everything is on a layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to group these. So Ctrl G, and I'm going to call that plastic grain. And then we're also going to group the base layers and call them plastic base. And now everything is nice and organized, at least. And then we're going to add a new fill layer on top of the plastic grain. And this one is just going to be color and roughness. And then we're going to add a black mask. And then we're going to add a generator. So right click and add generator. And then we're going to use the curvature generator. And that will create a curvature mask based on our baked curvature map. So let's go in there and go into the curvature settings. And let's bring everything down. Like I want everything at 0. But the sharp value, this is the only one that I want to like contribute. And even that one, let's set that one to 0.5. And then you can see we're getting a bunch of artifacts. So let's just blur those out by giving it some global blur. So let's try 1.25. And then if we zoom out, you can see this is adding a bit of a highlight around the edges, which is nice, but obviously way too intense. So first thing we want to do is set the base color all the way to white. And then we're going to set the blending mode to soft light. And now you can see it's not as visible anymore. And always make sure to like zoom in and out as well. And even with this, I think it's a bit too visible. So let's set it to maybe somewhere around 20. And now we're getting a bit of like edge highlights. Maybe try 30. But it's not like overbearing and we can't like see it everywhere. I think 25 is probably the sweet spot. Another thing we can do is change the roughness. So we can either crank it all the way up or all the way down. So I think the original one has 0.4. So let's actually set this to 0.4 and go to our plastic base layer. And maybe we bring down the roughness of these to like 0.35 and 0.35. And now it's a bit more reflective. And this edge mask takes away, makes it like less reflective on the corners. Yeah, let's set this to 0.4. And then let's take a look at what the roughness channel looks like. And yeah, we're getting just a tad of influence kind of like around these corners, which is not bad. Let's go to the roughness channel and let's try linear dodge. And then now this is a lot more intense with the roughness. And let's bring this down to maybe 50. Maybe even something around 30. I want this to be pretty subtle, but still have it have a bit of an impact. All right, so let's call this one plastic broad edges. And then let's keep going. So let's add some more breakup to the plastic. And we're going to add a new fill layer. And then we're going to call that plastic broad breakup. And we're going to make this white, and we only need color and roughness. And then let's add a black mask. And then we can use one of the smart masks that come with Substance Painter. So go to the Smart Mask tab and type in plastic and use the dust plastic and drag it into the mask. And now we can see we're getting this nice mask here. And let's just make a few adjustments. Let's go to the mask editor. The first thing we want to do is take a look at the settings. So maybe crank up the curvature to 0.6 to get more pronounced edges. And then we need to change the tiling of the textures. So go into texture 1, set the tiling to 3, go into texture 2, set the tiling to 3, and before we go any further here, we're going to change the blending mode to overlay. And now you can see we're getting this like subtle breakup. And let's crank down the intensity to something around 40 or 45. And then we also want to crank up the roughness so that we get some breakup. And we don't want to do too much, maybe something like 0.7 should be enough. And then if we take a look at the roughness channel, we're adding quite a bit of information here. So we can always go to the roughness layer here and see what we can do. Maybe set this to overlay as well, just to reduce the amount of breakup that we're introducing. And then go back to base color. I think 0.45 is good. And then let's see if we want to play with some of these texture tiling values again. So texture 1 obviously has the biggest impact because it's that scratch pattern that we're seeing. So maybe try to find something that gives us pretty decent results in some areas where those scratches would naturally appear. I think something like 3 is probably good. If you want, we can also reduce the contrast a little bit. Maybe -0.1 or something. And then here's what we're getting from this layer. And again, subtlety is key with these changes. You don't want to go overboard and all of a sudden add a ton of noise. It's better to have the stuff all on layers so that we can fine tune what we want the stuff to look like later on. So yeah, this is looking good. Let's move on to the next layer. Let's try adding some more intense edge damage, specifically some parts where, or some sections where there's deeper damage to the plastic. So let's add a new fill layer and call that plastic edge damage sharp. And this is going to be white for now. And then we only need everything but metalness, normal, and emissive. Then we're going to add a black mask. And then let's look for edge wear. So let's see. Maybe try the edge damage mask. And here you can see we're getting some pretty intense damage. So maybe let's try a generator and try metal edge wear. So that's probably better. And then let's really bring down the wear level. Let's try 0.05. So this is giving us some nice edge damage in these areas. And then let's just add a fill. And let's just use a procedural, just some noise to mask this out with. Maybe something that's a bit sharper. Let's try Grunge Map 8 and then do linear dodge. Actually subtract. And you can see that's breaking up this edge map a little bit more, and it gets rid of some of these like regular scratches that we're getting. Now this is obviously not looking super convincing yet, but there's a lot we can do to make this work actually. So first thing is we're going to go back into the base layer and we're going to give this some negative height so that it feels like it's chipping into the plastic, or it's getting rid of some of that plastic. So I obviously don't want to go like super intense, but let's try something like this for now. And let's set the color to maybe overlay. Or let's try soft light. And then I imagine if the plastic wears away, we're probably going to get just the outer layer gets scratched off, and then we're just getting a brighter version of the plastic. So this is, I think, pretty legit. But let's try maybe 50% of that. And let's also reduce the height a little bit, because it feels like it's a bit much. And let's crank up the roughness. These areas should be pretty dull, I feel like. So maybe try something like 0.6. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. And then we can go back to our wear generator. And let's just see what happens when we play with some of the wear level. So I think I really only want this to be on the corners. So something like this is probably good. And let's also turn on triplanar, because if we don't have it turned on, there's quite a few seams that we're getting, or it doesn't really go around the corners too much. And with triplanar, it's just more consistent. So let's do that. And then also with the grunge map that we're overlaying here, let's do triplanar projection as well, and really crank up the scale. Maybe try 10. Maybe go lower, 5. Set this back to 1 again and use UV projection. For some reason, I'm liking the result I'm getting from this a little bit better. So I'm going to leave it at UV projection. And we can also crank up the contrast. So let's try 0.6, just to get rid of even more areas where we have that damage. You know, I don't want to have it in a ton of areas, just here and there. And so to compensate for that, let's try upping the wear level just a little bit so that we get some more. And we also want to look at, you know, the combined version of this. See how it looks like when everything's meeting up. But I think so far this is actually pretty convincing. You know, there's scratches here and there. They're not everywhere, but mostly on the sharper edges. I want to see what this looks like if I turn this to black. Yeah, I don't like it as much with black. So maybe just reduce the amount a little bit here. And then go back into the wear generator. See what happens if we mess with the scale. I think the scale is actually good. Trying to see if there's a version where if I make the level higher, that it looks better, but it just becomes too noisy. So I think I'm going to leave the wear level at 0.1 and then add other layers of wear to everything. So yeah, let's check this out on this version. Looks fine. And then if you wanted to, you could also always go in and, you know, add a paint layer to this. So you can do add paint, and then you can paint on this layer a little bit, but you need to select an area you can actually paint on, which is the stuff over here. And then we could go in here and manually also, you know, paint in some edge damage in areas where you think it makes sense to have them. Just something I wanted to show you. This is definitely possible, but I'm going to stay away from this for now. I want to build up everything procedurally, and then if I need it, I might add more stuff to it. And maybe just let's bring down the intensity of that map a little bit. Let's try 85. And it's basically revealing a little bit more of the damage than we had before. So this was at 100. Let's try 75. And you can see this is a lot of back and forth, and you can also get caught up in just noodling around too much. And I think it's always good to just dial stuff in, and then in the bigger picture at the end of it, you can always go back and adjust things. So for now, I'm just going to leave it as is and then move forward to the next layer. So let's add more damage to the plastic. So we're just going to add a new fill layer. Call that plastic general damage 01. And then we're going to make this black in the color. And let's also give this a height of -0.02. And then we only want color hide roughness and get rid of metal normal and emissive, and maybe crank up the roughness to 0.75. And then we're going to add a black mask, and then we're going to add a fill to the mask. And then let's look for Grunge Map 14. Here we go. And this texture is now being used to mask out the channel, or that layer. And obviously this is too intense. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the tiling. So let's set this to something around 4 and try using a triplanar projection instead. And then we're also going to reduce the balance. So we're going to reduce the contrast, and we're going to bring this all the way down, maybe something like 0.125. And then you can see we're getting these indents here and there, or this damage on the plastic, which is actually looking pretty good. I'm not too happy with the location of this right here, so let's see if we can play with the scale a little bit. Let's try 5. It's not too bad. Maybe try 5.25. And then let's just see what this looks like over here. Maybe 5 is better. But it's giving us this nice damage here and there, which is looking good. So let's go back to the base color and set this to multiply, and then bring down the intensity, because I don't want it to be that black actually. Let's try something around 35 maybe. It feels good to me. And we're getting like random damage here and there. And if we want to, we can make this more intense, but I think for now maybe try something like this. And try 0.6. So if we go to roughness, you can see this is already pretty intense. Let's try 0.65. And yeah, I think that's looking good. We have a bunch of stuff here to break everything up. And just like before, if you have areas where you don't like what this looks like, but you overall like the placement of these things, you can always add a paint layer and then fill that with black. So if you press X to switch background and foreground color and then go to an area where you can actually paint, you can go in here and paint on this to remove. If you paint with white, you will add. So just keep that in mind. If you want to do it, you can. But for now, just like before, I'm sticking to a procedural build up for now. So yeah, there we go. So before we move forward, let's do some more tweaks. One thing I don't really like right now is the tiling of the grain. So let me actually go down to the plastic grain folder and go to the height layer and then increase the tiling on there. So right now we're at 50, let's try 75. And I think that looks better. It's just a bit more subtle. And then let's go back to the general damage that we've just added and bring this back down to 25. And let's go to the height here as well and reduce this to 175. And then I want to add some more inconsistencies on the plastic, some more damage. So I'm just going to duplicate the layer. So Control D, and we're going to rename that to damage 02. And then go into the grunge map slot. And this time we're going to use grunge map 13. So type that in and drag and drop that into the slot. And right now you can see this is obviously way too much, so we need to play with the detail. And we're going to really reduce that to 0.001. And now you can see we're getting these small blemishes or inconsistencies, which I think if we scale these up, will probably look pretty decent. So let's try somewhere around 12. And let's also add a levels adjustment layer on top of it. So select the grunge map and then right mouse button and then add levels. And then we can use the middle mouse button slider to tweak the levels and kind of like get rid of the smaller details and just keep the bigger spots in place. So let's try a value of 6. So you can just double click on the number and that brings up the input. Or maybe try 4. And then let's see if we need to make more changes. But I do like these small little details that we're getting from this adjustment. Let's take a look what that looks like over here. And you can see it's starting to like show up in these spots. And it's just more subtle detail on the plastic that I think looks pretty good. Maybe reduce the intensity of the multiply layer to 15. And then let's also go back to the main layer and reduce the height to 1.25 just to make it even more subtle. And let's try with the roughness. Maybe 0.7 for these guys, just to have a bit of breakup. All right. Let's add some dust specks to the plastic so that we get some points here and there. So I'm going to add a new fill layer. I'm going to call that plastic dust specks. And then as usual, we're going to fill the base color with white, and we only want color, height, and roughness. And then add a black mask, and then add a fill layer. And then let's look for dust. And try this grunge dust spread material. And And let's crank up the scale, maybe somewhere around 10, and really bring down the balance. And now you can see we're getting these dust specks everywhere. And you got to be careful, you don't want to add too much here. Again, just like with everything, subtlety really is king. So first let's go back to the base layer and let's set this to soft light maybe, or let's try overlay. Maybe we can keep it at normal and then just bring down the intensity to somewhere around 15. Or let's try 20. And then crank up the roughness, 0.7, and then let's also give it a bit of height information. 0.1 is probably too much. I want this to be super subtle, but since it's dust, it basically sits on top of the surface. So let's try 0.025. And then let's play with the values again. So try a different balance. That's too much. I don't want any of these like larger things to come in. And let's see. Maybe for this one, I'm also gonna try different values. So there's this one big detail that keeps repeating when we add this. I'm not a big fan of it, but we can just go in and like manually kind of like paint it out. So I'm just trying to find a value that feels good, where we get some subtle dust specks, but not too much overall. Let's crank up the intensity again, just to make it slightly more visible. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a paint layer, because I like the distribution of the points right now, but I don't like that we have these big spots. And then I'm going to go in my area where I can paint on the mesh. And if you hold down Control right mouse button, you can increase or decrease the size of your brush. And then with X, you can flip with background and foreground color. And we want to paint with black to remove from the mask. So I'm just going to look at my object and find these areas where this big detail keeps showing up. And I'm going in and I'm painting that out so that it's less visible. Because I'm not a big fan of this one detail. It just becomes very repetitive, and it's something that you immediately see when you look at the mesh, and that's not what I want with this. You know, I'm looking for just subtle surface breakup, and you know, you can have it here or there, but especially on a piece like the leg that you're going to duplicate around like 3 times, if you have a detail like that that becomes just super visible, it's better to not have it in there at all. So let's see what this looks like on the combined mesh again. Yeah, looking pretty good. And then maybe bring down the intensity again to something around 20. And let's see if we can bring up the balance. And maybe the height is a little too much. Let's try 175. Yeah, I think I'm feeling good about this. So let's just leave it at this for now. So next we're going to add some general scratches to the plastic. So let's duplicate that layer, Control D, and rename that plastic scratches. And then because it's scratches, they go inside. So we need to change the height. And then let's delete the paint layer and let's look for a different grayscale. So if you look for scratches, this list comes up. And then let's select Grunge Scratches Rough. And then you can see this itself is kind of a generator that you can play with. So first let's play with the tiling. Maybe set that to somewhere around 3. And let's mess with the balance as well. Bring that down to like 0.3 or something. And then we can bring down the quantity. There's too many scratches right now. So let's try something around 0.5 maybe. And then obviously, let's see, let's just play around with some of these attributes. Maybe we do need a few more, maybe around 0.6, and then crank up the tiling a little bit. No, that's too high. And then let's just go into the base layer and let's set this to soft light. Check out the base color. Yeah, that seems good. And maybe even crank this up just a little bit for now. And then let's see what this looks like. Now with these kind of details, it's always important to be really subtle. Otherwise, it just feels generic and automated. And so the first thing I'm going to do here is to mask out the scratches with ambient occlusion. So the areas where we have a lot of ambient occlusion, I don't want to have a ton of scratches on, because stuff like this down here that's in the shadow usually doesn't get scratched too much, or you know, the inside of this, there's no reason why there would be a ton of scratches here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a new generator, and we're going to choose ambient occlusion in the generator. And then let's just look at the mask of this. And then in the generator, let's just play with the balance and really darken these the dark spots. So everything that's black won't receive any scratches. And then we're going to switch back to mask by pressing M. And now we need to switch this to subtract so that this mask subtracts from our scratches. Or actually we can set it to multiply, because it just removes the scratches in the dark area. So you can see without the ambient occlusion, we have all the scratches on the inside. And with the ambient occlusion, it just gets rid of these scratches in areas where they shouldn't be in the first place. So we shouldn't have any scratches on the inside of this here now. And you can see without the ambient occlusion, we have a ton of them there. And this just helps to kind of like balance things out a lot. And then let's take a look and see what this looks like. Let's play with the balance some more. It's a bit too intense for me still. So first let's try reducing the height. These scratches don't need to be super deep. And then we can add another layer on top of it, another image to mask stuff out with. So let's do a fill layer. And let's look for an image that has a lot of contrast in like wide areas. Let's try this stain image here. Let's just drag that on there. And then we're going to set that to multiply as well, so that it subtracts from the layer underneath. So right now it takes a lot away. So let's go into the balance and play with that. and then see what we can do here. So maybe reduce the scale. And then let's take a look at the mask really quick. Set this to normal again. Okay, so everything that's black gets removed and everything that's white gets stays in place. So basically we're multiplying these two layers on top of one another. So if I do multiply, you can see it removes from the stains. And then let's play with the balance. And let's press M again just to see what this looks like, because we really need to preview this. And I'm not a big fan of what this texture looks like. Maybe try this one here instead. So the grunge map 07 seems to work a little better. Let's increase the tiling here. There's still areas where it just feels unnatural to me. Let's go to the scratches again. Let's see if we can rotate this 90 degrees, if it does anything. Or maybe 45. We're getting a bit more like vertical scratches on these side panes or side panels. And you can see that this is a lot of tweaking, like it's literally just going back and forth, trying to find the right values. And it takes a bit of time, and you just have to find something that feels good to you. And sometimes, you know, that takes 5 minutes. Sometimes it takes a lot longer than that. It's just trying to make it work, I guess. Let's blur the scratches a bit as well. And we remove, it basically removes the amount of scratches that we have. Maybe try 0.35. And now it's starting to feel a little bit better to me. So we don't have scratches everywhere. Maybe crank up the tiling again. And we can also reduce the intensity of the second map. And now we're getting a bit of variety in the scratches. Let's try a triplanar projection for the scratches and see what that gives us. Feel like something like this is almost better. Because now we're having fewer scratches. And they're not like super noticeable. And again, as usual, just a lot of tweaking, trying to find the right values. Feel like this doesn't look too bad. There's not a ton of scratches on my mesh right now, which is good. I don't want there to be a ton. Just a few here and there. In areas where they would naturally occur. Let's see, maybe just mess with the tiling a little bit. I think I'm going to leave it at 2.25. And again, you know, check from close and far away. This is not looking too bad to me. One of the things I don't like is how this one scratch here like is repeating. So we can also add a paint layer and just paint this out with black. That way we don't have the same type of scratch in this one very prominent location. But yeah, this is good. You know, just a few scratches. Let's one last thing we can do if we want to adjust the global look of this, we can also add a levels and then, you know, move it over slightly if we want to make them a little bit smaller. Let's try 2. Maybe 1.75. And, you know, that makes it just a bit less noticeable and a bit less intense. So there we go. Next, we're going to add some general dirt. So let's just add a fill layer and call that one plastic dirt. And let's make this black for now. And maybe set the intensity to 50%. And we only need color, roughness, and that's it. And then we're going to add a black mask and we're going to add a generator to it. So right mouse button, add generator, and then just look for the dirt generator. So type in generator dirt, double click on it. And as you can see, this has added a bunch of dirt to my object. And if you press C, you can actually cycle through the channels. So you can see up here by pressing C, you can cycle, and then M, you go back to material mode. So let's just take a look at the mask for now. And what I don't like is that we're getting dirt everywhere here on the mesh. So let's go into the generator and then see what we can do. So let's turn down the dirt level to maybe something around 0.5. See what that looks like in 3D. And maybe crank up the intensity of this layer for a little bit. And then also let's crank up the roughness. Let's try 0.7. And that's more in line with what I was thinking. But it still feels a little too uniform. So let's take a look. So there's a bunch of options we can do in here. Edge masking, which we can probably leave at 0.5. But to break this up, I think I'm just going to add another layer. So let's add a fill layer. And then let's see, maybe try dirt 1. Drag that in here. And then we're going to set this to multiply. Let's try subtract. And then let's play with tiling. Let's set this to triplanar projection, and then let's set the tiling to, let's try 3. Maybe 4, and maybe just reduce the intensity a little bit. And that breaks it up. But I want a little bit more, some larger scale variation, so we're going to add another fill layer. And let's look for something leaky. Maybe this one here, leak small. Let's add that. Let's set that to subtract as well. And you can see it's removing from the texture, which is good. Let's try increasing the scale. Well, first let's set it to triplanar projection. maybe try a scale of 5. And then let's play with the balance. Can probably crank this up to somewhere around 6.5. Or maybe 0.6. And that gives us a nice breakup in the dirt that we're seeing here. And now we can also go back to our original layer and see what happens if we increase the dirt level. Maybe try 0.525. For the most part, I don't think there's much we need to change here in this layer. And maybe we add a levels to the whole thing. See what we can do with this. Don't think we need it. Maybe reduce the intensity of the leaks a little bit, just to get a little bit less breakup. And then go back to our original layer, set the blending mode to multiply. Let's see what happens if we color this a little bit. You know, just some slight color instead of this being black. Problem is it's gonna blend on the red material as well, so you kind of have to be careful with how the colors interact. So maybe we just really tone it down. Don't think we need much more than this. And maybe crank down the intensity to 75. Take a look at these layers again. Just seeing what the different options are doing. But I think that's okay for the most part. So we now have a bunch of dirt everywhere, which is not really what I want. So for example, there's all kinds of dirt going on the inside here. I think this stuff down here is okay. We can definitely have a little bit of dirt in these areas here. But let's bring the intensity down again. And then on the dirt one, let's see if we can mess with the tiling a little bit more, just to get some sharper details. And I think that's good. But like I was saying, I don't want the dirt to be on the inside of our object. So what we can do is we can just add a paint layer, and then we can switch to polygon fill mode over here. And now when you drag on your mesh, or when you drag on your UVs, it'll fill your polygons with the color you've selected. So right now I'm painting with white, which means I'm fully adding dirt, but I want to remove dirt. So I'm gonna paint with black. And then I'm gonna go in here and I'm gonna just go through the inside of this guy and select all of these faces and get rid of the dirt. Let's see if we can switch to the mask channel here as well. Yep. Gives you a bit of a better view of what's going on. And then we need to do the same for the top. So just go through here and get rid of all the dirt. And then on the outside we can leave it. I think that's fine. Just want to make sure that we're not adding a bunch of dirt to the inside. And I also don't want any dirt on my grenade part. So let's go back to 3D view. Switch to material mode, switch to paint mode, see what that looks like. And as you can see, there's no dirt being added to the inside. I also want to remove this part here. So let's switch to channel mode again. And just go through all of this. So now we don't have any dirt here, which is great. And these guys here, we probably don't want any dirt on them as well. So let's see where this would be to paint on. So yeah, it was the one over here. But let's undo, because I did a bit too much. So this is going to be a little bit unfortunate to select. Well, this actually is going to be a metal material, so the dirt is not going to show on these pieces, so I don't have to worry about them. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm thorough and I don't forget anything. And here we probably want to get rid of it as well, so let's just do this, and that should cover everything. Then we can press M to go back to material view, go to paint mode and press F2 to maximize the window. And now you can see the balls pretty clean. And this is looking good as well. So we have a little bit of dirt in certain sections, especially closer to the ground, which is good. And we're just going to leave it at that. So I think our plastic is done now. And we can, for now, move on to the metal to get that started. So let's add a fill layer and drag it into the metal group, and then drag it on top of that base layer. And this one, we only want color, roughness, metalness, normal, and emissive. And then let's start with the base color. Let's try 0.15. And then for roughness, maybe try 0.3. And metallic, let's go with 0.95. And then we want to add a generator, and we're going to look for a matte finish rough. So type that in and select it. And this one only affects the normal channel. So let's turn off everything but the normal channel. And then you can see we're getting this type of detail here. And this looks really good on the metal, but we need to change the scale. So change the first value to maybe 8 and the grunge scale to maybe around 8. And that gives us a nice breakup. And maybe bring down the intensity to 0.4 just to make it less intense overall. And that's just our metal base layer. And then add some color variation to it. So we're just gonna add a bit of color information. So let's call that metal color variation. And let's just leave it here for now. And then we're gonna add a black mask. And then we're gonna add a fill. And let's see. For the color variation, let's see if we can find a grunge map or something like that. So let's look for grunge map, and then what do we have here? Let's look for grunge map 02 and try this one, which is a bit streaky. So let's add that in. And then you can see we are getting some color variation, but it's a bit too intense. So the first thing on the color variation we want to do is set the UV projection to triplanar project. And then we can also go in the mask editor and then maybe set the tiling to 4. And that seems to work better. So with that, let's go back to our base material and set this to multiply and bring down the intensity to maybe 50. And I think this is still a little too strong. So let's play with the color. So yeah, we just want a little bit of color variation. So we're going from this to this. And I think that's enough. I don't want to add too much noise to this. So just like we did on the plastic, I want to add some surface height variation. So let's add a new fill layer and call that one metal height variation, and only turn on color height and roughness. And let's also set the height to negative 0.002. And then we're going to add a black mask and 2 fill layers for 2 textures. So for the second one, let's look for a black and white spot texture. Let's look for B&W spot 2 and load that in and turn off the first fill layer, otherwise we're not going to see it. And then you can see we're getting a bunch of noise here. So first thing I want to do is set that to triplanar projection and then crank up the scale. So maybe try 8. That seems okay. And maybe bring down the intensity here, something like 30%. And then let's add another layer. This time we're going to look for, let's try a grunge map. Let's try grunge map 12. Should be these kind of strokes here. And then same as before, we're going to set this to triplanar projection. And we're going to crank up the scale. And then we don't want the blending mode in normal, but linear dodge, so that it just adds to whatever underneath. And then we're also going to reduce this down to around 30. So maybe we need to crank up the scale here as well. Maybe something around 10 would be good. And I guess we can also just make it black and see what happens when we multiply that on top. I guess that doesn't make sense. So let's just keep this just to hide information, no roughness. So let's just see, maybe we need to increase the tiling even more to something like this. That's looking good. We're getting some variation in the height. But right now this is still like super strong, I feel like. So let's really tone it down. Let's try 0.5. And yeah, now it's barely visible. So maybe crank it up just a tad. And now you can see we're getting a little bit, and we have to check in the final render if this is going to be too strong or not. Maybe for now leave it at 0.01, or let's leave it at 0.75. And do we need to crank up the spots a bit? Maybe this goes to 50 so that we see it a little bit more. And now the metal is not perfectly flat. So we're just going to leave it at that and tweak it later. Let's keep going and add some dirt to the metal. So I'm going to make a new layer and call that metal dirt. And maybe 0.1. I'm not sure if I'm going to add another one or not. And here we just need color and roughness. And then let's set the base color to black. And we can leave the roughness like this for now. And then set it to multiply and maybe set it to 50% for now. And then we're going to add a black mask. And then we're going to add a generator to the mask. And then I'm going to look for the dirt generator and add that to my mask by double clicking on it. And now you can see we're adding a bit of dirt. So here's essentially what's going on. I can press C to cycle through everything. And let's look at the mask for now. And let's play with the dirt level. It's too strong at the moment. So let's bring that down and maybe even increase the contrast just a little bit. And let's see if the triplanar makes a difference, but not really too much. Maybe crank up the scale to something around 8. And we still want the edge masking on. And then let's go to the 3D view, to the material view. Maybe crank this up just to see what the metal does. And then also crank up the roughness a little bit so that this stands out some more. It's probably too much. Let's look at the roughness. Let's try 0.55. And this is getting us a good kind of dirt layer on the metal. So let's see, maybe we need to tweak it a little bit more. I like what this looks like out here. I'm just concerned if this is a little too strong. And I think the dirt here is working pretty well too. So the first thing I'm going to do is set this back down to 50% because the black was probably just too much. And now this already feels a lot better. And let's try to crank up the roughness just a bit again. And now it's more in the reflections that we're getting some variation, and I think that's a good thing. So let's leave the dirt at that. We can still tweak it later on if we want to. So let's add some edge highlights. So make a new layer, call that one Metal Edge Highlights. And here we just want color and roughness. Crank up the base color to 1. Set it to soft light for now. And then we're just going to add a black mask, and we're going to add a generator again. And we're going to use the curvature generator. So select that one. And then let's go into the curvature settings. And just like before, we're just going to crank everything down but the fine. And then we're also going to play with the balance. Maybe something like that. And let's look at the base color. And you can see we're getting some highlights on the edges, and let's tone it down just a little bit. Snap that back in there. And let's just set this to 50%. And also let's play with the roughness. We can reduce the roughness so that the edges appear shinier. I don't want them more dull, so let's just set this to 0.2. And then we should see darker corners on the roughness, which is good. Wondering if I should, how far I should push this. You can also add a levels adjustment layer and work with that if you want to tweak it this way. And I like the brighter edges, but you have to be careful to not overdo it, otherwise it ends up being pretty cartoony and stylized. So just make sure you don't do that. And just like with everything, we're going to have to test this in the render and possibly tweak those settings later on as well. But I think I'm going to leave it at that. Let's take a look at how this affects this thing. Yeah, still looking okay. Stuff's looking good too. Same as here. Maybe bring down the dirt to 40 in the diffuse. And then we're going to leave it at that for the edge highlights. So just on some of the other plastic pieces, I want some scratches on the metal as well. And since we already have that in the plastic layer, I'm just going to go there, Control D to duplicate that layer, and then we're going to move that out of the plastic group and rename that Metal Scratches 01. And then we're going to drag that into the metal group, and you can already see them show up. And then let's see what we can do here to adjust it to our metal. So maybe we go into the generator and we can increase the amount to around 1. I think that feels a little bit better on the metal. And this feels pretty intense for the height, I think. So I'm going to bring that down to 0.01. And I'm wondering if I want the inside of the scratch to be dull or not. There's also something to it being super reflective. So maybe try and go more on the reflective side with this. See what that looks like here. And then I think let's disable that paint layer. And then we're going to add a new paint layer. And I'm going to set that to multiply. And now I'm going to select this whole ball because I don't want any scratches on this. So we can just use polygon fill and select all of this, but we need to do it with black, I think. Yep, and that removed all of it here. So let's just make sure we've got everything. And yeah, we're having some scratches. That's looking pretty good overall, I would say. Maybe bring up the brightness of the metal in general just a little bit. So I'm going to go back to my metal base and see what 0.2 looks like. And I also think the height variation is probably too strong. Let's reduce this back down to 0.005. I'm just looking for like an ever so slight touch. Then here the ambient occlusion pretty much cancels all of the scratches out on the inside. I think I'm okay with that. Could always just reduce the intensity of that layer. And that way we're at least getting like a little bit in the areas that are in shadow. But yeah, let's keep it at that for the scratches for now. Let's start adding a rubber material. So let's make a folder group, bring that all the way up here, and then let's call that rubber. And then we're going to do right mouse button, and we're going to do add mask with color selection, pick color, and choose the green color down here. Now everything in this folder will only be displayed where the green color is on our ID map. And then add a fill layer by clicking on the button up here. And then drag that layer into the folder and just call that one rubber_base. And we're going to turn off height, metal, normal, and emissive. And let's change the base color first. So let's make this darker and crank up the roughness to somewhere around 0.5 for a material that looks sort of like rubber. And then we're going to add a new layer and build up the material. So just like before, we're going to add a height layer, and then we're going to add a black mask and a fill layer in the black mask. And we're going to go to our procedurals, and we're going to drag the 3D simplex noise in the grayscale slot. And not much has changed because we need to increase the tiling. So let's crank this up to like 1500 and crank down the balance, and then also add a filter and then blur this out a little bit. So look for blur and then really reduce this intensity. Just want a little bit. And then let's turn down the intensity here as well. So let's see what the blur is actually doing. Can't really tell much of a difference here. Let's try 0.1. Might be a bit too much. Just want this to be a bit softer, and this is fine. And then let's see. Just find the value in the balance that looks good for you. And I think this is okay. It's probably still a bit too intense, so let's crank this down. And then we're going to duplicate it and call that one rubber height 02. And let's delete the grayscale and let's go to textures. And let's actually look for some kind of a grunge. Well, actually it needs to be in procedurals. Let's see if we can find something. Maybe the grunge rough cast. Drag that in there. And let's go to the balance slider. Something like this. And then we're going to add a blur filter again. And let's try 0.1 for this. And then let's use triplanar projection and crank up the scale. Play with the balance some more and reduce the height. It's just a bit more breakup. Just trying to find the right value here. Don't want this to be too intense, but I also don't want it to be non-visible. So maybe something around here is good. And let's bring this down to 0.6. And now we have our two height information layers. So let's add a new fill layer and then just add some edge definition. And set this one to white, and we only want color and roughness, and then add a black mask and add a generator. So I'm going a bit faster here because we've done all of this a lot of times before, and we're just going through the same steps. So let's crank down the intensity of these huge layers and only keep the sharp, and then play with the balance. And maybe the contrast is fine. And then we're going to add another fill. And we're just going to look for procedural. Let's just try the clouds again. Set this to subtract. And first, let's play with the tiling. And then play with the balance. It's removing too much right now. Let's crank up the scale. Let's set this actually to triplanar projection. And try 64. And then just reduce this a little bit. 50%. And then you can bring this back in if you want. And now this breaks it up a little bit. You can even try increasing the tiling here. And that's good. So let's just set this to soft light, or try overlay, or try linear dodge add, and bring this down a little bit. I really just want like some subtle overlay. And then the roughness doesn't really do that much here, but I guess we can crank it all the way up to make these areas more dull. And then lastly, to finish this up, let's see, I think this is still a little strong. Let's just add another fill layer and call that rubber dirt 01. Make this dark, maybe like a brownish type color for now. Only do color and roughness, and then we're going to do add black mask, add generator, and then look for the dirt generator and select it. And you can see that one is giving you some dirt. It's actually looking pretty decent with the default value. So first we're going to set the color blending mode to, let's try soft light. Let's keep it at normal. And then bring down the intensity to like 75 maybe. Let's try 60. And then go with the roughness and crank this up to like 0.5. Actually, we need more than that because 0.5 is the default value. So now we should get some variation. So let's try just 0.55. And that breaks it up a little bit. And then also maybe increase the color and reduce the saturation. That seems all right. And then see if we can go to the mask, and then maybe we can increase the scale a little bit. That doesn't do much. I think I'm going to leave it at 4. And let's see if we mess with the amount. Maybe bring this down to like 0.25. Let's look for the mask channel. Play with these values a bit. But honestly, I think this is pretty good. We just want a bit of breakup, you know, and don't want this rubber to look like the same than everything else. I think the edge definition might still be a bit too strong, so let's reduce it to 40. And then check the base color. Let's try 35. And then also go to the base material and bring up the value to like 0.4. Sorry, let's undo. Something like this. It might be a bit too bright. And let's leave it at that. Yeah, it's looking good to me. I don't think we need much more for the rubber. It's a very basic material, but does the trick, and it looks like a rubber. Might be a bit too reflective actually, but this stuff is always easy to tweak. You know, you can always just increase the roughness, but let's try 0.55. Maybe that's a better value for it. All right, let's leave it at that for the rubber.